Hey Nutmeggers, welcome to the special 5-year anniversary of PRIMO Nutmeg. Thank you all for joining me today. This is a very special episode. In addition to looking back on the last 5 years, I have a couple of big announcements to make. I'm also going to be taking patron questions. That's right, I will be answering your questions. There is no guest today, there is nothing flashy. So for those of you who want to learn more about this show, why I have done it for the last 5 years, and hear a couple of big announcements about the next episode and the future of the show, please do stay tuned. I guess I'm just going to start off by talking about how this show started 5 years ago. It was on August 13th, 2015, that the very first episode of PRIMO Nutmeg got uploaded. That episode was actually recorded a few days earlier on August 7th, 2015. And that was right after the very first GOP debate back in 2015. I don't know if many of you recall that. It was a Fox News debate. Megyn Kelly was one of the journalists asking the candidates questions. I think actually that was when they first introduced the two-tiered debates, because there were so many GOP candidates. They had an undercard debate and then a main stage debate. And there was that interaction between Megyn Kelly and Donald Trump, where he made an allusion to women having their periods afterwards, I think. Also made a comment about Rosie O'Donnell. And so it was right after that very first GOP debate that my friends Jack, Patrick, and I got together for the very first episode of PRIMO Nutmeg. Now, to take a few steps back, prior to this, I'd always had an interest in journalism, and I'm going to actually get into that a little bit more when I answer the patron questions later. But in 2014 into 2015, I was actually in grad school, and I was doing a college radio show. And that was really just a rock show, but I would also have my friends on to kind of just really just bullshit. We would talk about the music and also share stories. And I actually really loved doing that show. It was a lot of fun. It was interesting because, it was a weird situation where I was the last person running the radio station at the night. So even though I had no real experience in radio, I guess because I was a grad student, they would let me go in at midnight, do a 2-hour show until 2 a.m., and then shut down the radio station. And I was the only person in the radio station by myself managing it, pretty much free to do whatever I wanted. And it was just so much fun. And it was in this old clock tower, so it was this really weird situation. You can go up on the roof, or you go up a ladder and hang out, while the music was playing or after the show. And I would bring friends up there. So one time in particular, I actually had a party in the radio station. So I was hanging out, like 9, 10 o'clock at a bar, and invited, all these people from my grad program to come have a party at the radio station, and actually blacked out on air. So that was a lot of fun. And I really enjoyed doing that show. Again, I'd have guests on all the time. We talk about music. In this grad program, there's people from all over the world, so I got to hear about different people's backgrounds and learn about them and become friends with them. And it was so much fun for me doing that show that when I moved back to Connecticut after that, when I finished my graduate degree, I wanted to keep doing that because it was almost like therapy in a way. It was just so much fun to go on the air, play music for people who are listening out there. And then also have these interesting conversations with again, folks from all over the world, and to learn more about them. About the same time, too, it seems like podcasting had kind of become a thing. My friend John had started a podcast, which was really similar to what you're listening to right now, just one person rambling. And he did that for about 5 episodes. My buddy Rob also started a podcast that I think went about 12 episodes or so, where he would interview people locally, his friends and whatnot. There's also 2 other folks who I knew, John and Ethan, a different John, and they had a show where they would kind of just talk about politics and I think some nostalgic kind of pop culture as well. And for whatever reason, about that time, 2014, 2015, 2016, I don't know if it was the success of Joe Rogan at that time or what it was exactly, but podcasting just had become such a big thing. So I decided that I wanted to do a podcast. And again, it seemed like a good time after that very first GOP debate in August of 2015. So that's why 5 years ago, I met in my friend's basement. We ended up calling him Producer McG. And I have to give a big shout out to him because he really helped create this show and keep this show going for so long. The first, I don't know, like the majority of the first 100 episodes of this show were recorded in his basement. And he did a lot of the editing. That gradually reduced over time. I took over the editing, but in those early, 50 episodes or more, he was doing 100% of the editing. He was just editing this show. And I can't thank him enough for that. He was putting together YouTube videos. So really, I don't think he gets enough credit for all you folks out there who have appreciated this show. We all owe a big debt to producer McG for really helping put it together. So we would meet in his basement on a pretty regular interval. And the first several episodes of this show were really just me and my friends hanging out, similar to that radio show that I had been doing. It was me and my friends hanging out in a basement, talking about everything. Yes, politics was a really big component of it, but we also would just talk about personal stories. We talk about sports. We talk about movies, really just anything. And the first 4 episodes of the show was just me talking with friends, essentially. The 5th episode of this show, which was recorded in September of 2015, I decided to reach out to a local celebrity here, Bob Backlund. He is a former WWE champion. He lived one town over from where I was living at the time. So I decided to reach out to him to see if he wanted to do an interview, and he did. So he actually came over my house, sat at the dining room table. Producer McG was there, and we just had a 45-minute interview. And that was really my first celebrity interview. So again, I'd like to thank Bob Backlund for being that first celebrity guest. That kind of changed the trajectory of the show a little bit. I continued doing those shows pretty much the majority of the time. It would be with my friends, hanging out, bullshitting. But then I started doing some interviews. So episode 7, I interviewed somebody from the ACLU here in Connecticut. After that, on episode 14, I interviewed somebody who was involved with the Bernie Sanders campaign here in Connecticut. Episode 15, I interviewed a Connecticut state senator. And then in episode 24, I finally got, I guess, what would be my big break and having a very big celebrity, having Noam Chomsky on the show. Again, I have a history in independent journalism. I've done writing for years, so I've interviewed Noam Chomsky in the past. This was not my first Noam Chomsky interview. But episode 24, in February of 2016, this was the first time that Noam Chomsky was on PRIMO Nutmeg. And it was a half-an-hour interview. We talked about the 2016 election. The show was pretty small at the time, so this was a really big deal for the show. I imagine that's when a lot of you really long-time listeners, the oldest listeners to the show, that's probably when you guys subscribed, listening to episode 24, the first time that Noam Chomsky was on. After that, I continued just doing episodes with my friends. John McAfee was on episode 32 when I interviewed several Libertarian Party candidates, so that was also a big deal at the time. And then on episode 37, that's the first time that Jill Stein was on the show. And I have to thank her for being so willing to do a half-an-hour interview. That was in the summer of 2016, so right after I celebrated the 1-year anniversary of this show on episode 40, that's really when I started getting serious about the show and started trying to have guests on frequently. Again, up until that point, it had mostly just been me and my friends hanging out, having a good time, really just recording ourselves drinking and bullshitting about anything. But after episode 40 or so, that's when I really started having a lot of guests on. Episode 42 was with Cindy Sheehan. Episode 43 was with Dale Brown. Episode 45 was with Medea Benjamin. Episode 47 was with Darrell Castle, who was the Constitution Party candidate that year. And again, I really started having these guests on pretty frequently. But I do have to say, if any of you ever want to know what my favorite episode to record of this show has ever been, it was not an interview, or at least it was not an interview with one person. My very favorite episode of this show, and it's a shame because it's only got 223 views on YouTube at this moment, but it was my absolute favorite episode of the show to record, episode 49. It's called the Baseball and Politics Road Atlas. And what this is that the week before the 2016 election, I went on a road trip across the U.S. I went to Philadelphia, I went to Cleveland, I went to Indiana, I went to Kansas, I went to Iowa, I went to Chicago. And what I was doing at this time was I was following the 2016 World Series between the Cleveland Indians and the Chicago Cubs, which was a very interesting World Series and probably really the best World Series of all time. I was following this World Series while also meeting and talking to people about the 2016 election. And again, this was 1 week before the 2016 election. So as the World Series is happening, as this great monumental World Series is taking place, there's also the 2016 election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. So I just thought it was a really great kind of synchronicity there where you had two candidates who, we kind of always thought would run, but never thought would be against each other, and two teams who we always thought would make it to the World Series, but never thought it would be against each other. And it was just this amazing experience of traveling the country, talking to all these people about politics and about baseball and getting all these different perspectives from so many different people. And I would even go to the World Series, go outside of the World Series in Cleveland, for example, and there was folks out there campaigning for Jill Stein or just protesting or other independent presidential candidates trying to meet with people. And then outside of the World Series games that were played at Wrigley, there were people there who were demonstrating in favor of Donald Trump. There was also people who were protesting the name of the Cleveland Indians. And I went to a Hillary Clinton event and a Donald Trump event in a matter of hours in Iowa. So I drove across Iowa in the course of, it must have been, 6 hours, going from a Hillary Clinton event, which was this sad little event in this gymnasium, this high school where the entire audience was really just kids who I imagine must have been getting extra credit. And it was just, it was such this just stupid, dumb, unenergetic event for this presidential candidate, the Democratic Party's nominee, the former First Lady and Secretary of State, and she could barely fill this little gymnasium. And then I drove across Iowa to this big outdoor Donald Trump event with just hundreds or thousands of people filling up this big open area. And I at least could tell then that Donald Trump had a pretty good chance of winning the election. So again, I have to recommend that. It's not the best quality production on that. It's just, it's pretty much a slideshow. So what I did is I kind of was taking pictures, and then at the end I took the recording, which I had all recorded on my iPhone, and I matched up the recording to the pictures that I had taken. So it's really just a slideshow as far as the visual component, but if you just listen to it, I really think it's probably the best thing I've ever done on this show. So please do listen to that. And then a good second place, I think, was episode 51, which is just titled Trump, and that was election night 2016. So that night, me, my friends Rob and Jack really just bar hopped and kind of followed the election as it unfurled. And then we actually went to this event in Hartford, and it was in this hotel, and it was kind of hidden and not really that open to the public. Like you could go there if you knew about it, but it was kind of secret. And it was the Democratic Party's event that they were putting on. So there were senators there, the Democratic governor of Connecticut was there, the Democratic mayor of Hartford was there. Really, everyone who is a player in the Democratic Party in Connecticut was at this event. And it was here that the tide of the election started to turn. So we got there and people were excited and still thinking Hillary Clinton was going to win. And as we were there, people just started leaving. And it was this really odd thing where it was this really lively party when we first got there. And then just people started disappearing. And this was happening as Hillary Clinton started losing Florida and Pennsylvania and these states that she needed to win. And it was also interesting because I took it upon myself to try to interview some of these people briefly who were there. So I spoke to Senator Chris Murphy and I spoke to Senator Richard Blumenthal. And, I kind of thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. That was sort of what the narrative was that pretty much everybody was believing, except for, I have to say, my friend Jack, because he called it even on the first episode of the show. He saw the appeal of Donald Trump and saw that he was going to appeal to a lot of these disenfranchised voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. So a big shout out to Jack for being very in tune with the electorate in 2016. But when I interviewed both Chris Murphy and then Richard Blumenthal, I was asking about the prospect of a Hillary Clinton presidency and what that would mean for foreign policy, specifically in regards to Russia. And Chris Murphy, when he gave the answer, it was really about how Hillary Clinton was a supporter of soft power and how she would be a more level-headed president. And then when I interviewed Richard Blumenthal, his response was, well, I'm not going to make any predictions about the outcome of this election. So you could see, and again, this was done in the course of half an hour between the two. So it was very quick how the tide of the election changed in that room. And it was it was a really fun night. It was a cool way to cover the election. And I really, really enjoyed it. It was great that my friends Jack and Rob was there. That was really just an amazing night. So looking back, I have to say those two episodes, episode 49 and episode 51, those were probably my two favorite episodes of this show. They were the most fun to record. They were the most adventurous. They were the most gonzo journalism. And just looking back, like that was the most fun I've had doing this show was episode 49, episode 51, which are real journalism and again, real gonzo journalism. And the funny side note that I have to add to that too is that I got so drunk on election night, just completely wasted, that the next day, which was a Wednesday, and I had to go to work, I was too hungover to work. I couldn't focus. I think I was probably throwing up. I was so hungover that I couldn't do my job, my day job at the time. So I had to call out sick, leave during the middle of the day. It's funny looking back because I wonder if people thought that I was like depressed that Donald Trump won, so I had to leave work because of that. But I decided to go then, or maybe I had already scheduled it, but I had an interview with Jake the Snake Roberts, who was a very famous professional wrestler, a big WWE superstar, WWF superstar back in the early 90s and late 80s. And I recorded an interview with him the day after the 2016 election. And that interview was really the first time that this show ever made any headlines, because it was during that interview with Jake the Snake Roberts that he was talking about another professional wrestler, the Honky Tonk Man, and about how he had been trying to trademark other wrestlers' names when the trademarks had expired. So this got picked up by a lot of different wrestling and kind of nerd culture news outlets out there, maybe some tabloids as well. And it actually got a response from the Honky Tonk Man on Twitter where he was going after Jake the Snake Roberts for his drug addictions and saying things about put down the crack pipe, stuff like that. And that's really the first time that the show had really gotten any kind of media exposure. Again, I had been kind of getting big guests at that point. I had Jill Stein and Noam Chomsky and John McAfee on the show up until that point, but that was the first time that I actually started getting reported on in any kind of media. So after that, I continued having big guests on the show. Ajamo Baraka was on, another former Green Party presidential nominee from 2004, David Cobb, he was on the show. John McAfee was back on the show. On episode 62, I actually traveled to Washington, D.C. for Donald Trump's inauguration, and that was a lot of fun to record too. So my buddy Rob and I, the same Rob from election night, we drove down to Washington, D.C., we stayed in a hotel, and we were there for these massive protests against Donald Trump. And I think looking back, the way that the corporate media reports it is that the big event was the Women's March, and that's when you had a million women out in the streets wearing the pussy hats and just protesting Donald Trump. But the day of the inauguration, which I think was the day before the Women's March or a couple days before, that's when you saw the really rambunctious anarchists out in the street burning things and setting fire to limousines and smashing windows. and having tear gas shot at them by the police. So that was also, that was a bit of gonzo journalism. That was a lot of fun to record as well. While I was in Washington the same day, actually, as those protests, same day as Inauguration Day, we also went to the Libertarian National Committee's headquarters and interviewed Wes Benedict there. And that was interesting just to see the inside of the Libertarian Party, which is a lot smaller than you think it would be. It was really just sort of like the average office space that you might expect for, I don't know, a dentist's office or something like that. Like it's not that big. It's maybe a couple floors. The basement, they have a lot of promotional material, and they had like framed posters from past presidential campaigns. And then upstairs is just sort of like a lobby with some different office spaces, and it's not that big. It's not like a huge office building or anything like that. But for whatever reason, around episode 66, I decided to try to have some childhood heroes of mine on the show, and I reached out to the original cast of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and decided to have them for individual interviews on the show. So episode 66 was with Jason David Frank, who was the Green Ranger and the White Ranger on the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. He also made some headlines when he was on the show talking about CM Punk, because as you may recall, professional wrestler CM Punk decided to become a UFC fighter and had some terrible fights where he just had the crap kicked out of him. But Jason David Frank is also trained in mixed martial arts. So he was challenging CM Punk to sort of a celebrity death match, if you will. And that also was picked up by many different tabloids. And that was really the second time that this show got any kind of media exposure. And again, the first two times, they really weren't about politics. They were about sort of professional wrestling and MMA. Right after that, I had several other original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers on the show. Walter Manuel Jones, David Yost, and Amy Jo Johnson. I also started having economists on the show pretty regularly. Walter Block, Thomas Greco, and many others. Ray McGovern was first on in episode 79, and he would be back on in the future. Jill Stein was back in episode 83. Episode 84 in April of 2017, I actually sat down with the original UFC champion, Royce Gracie. We sat down at a little yogurt shop here in Connecticut, and unfortunately the production quality isn't that good. There was a lot of background noise, and overall just my editing skills weren't that great at the time, but it was really cool to sit down with him and speak with him. Then on episode 85, a couple days later, and actually this was recorded on Earth Day, I sat down with Ralph Nader and got to interview Ralph Nader for 15 minutes. Ralph Nader is a big hero of mine. Earlier, when I was doing journalism, independent journalism, when I was younger, and student journalism, I reported on Ralph Nader's 2004 and 2008 campaigns. So it was great to actually finally get to sit down with him, ask him some questions, and he'd be back on the show in the future. So it was finally good to have him as a guest on Primo Nutmeg. Episode 100 was really big for the show. I had another former UFC champion, Ken Shamrock, on the show. He was also a former WWF Intercontinental Champion. So it was really cool to talk to another big professional wrestler / MMA celebrity. Then on the very next episode, 101, Dr. Ron Paul was on the show, and it was great to finally speak with him. His 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns, I think, were very impactful to the political dialogue in this country. I think actually the Tea Party movement was kind of a co-opting and perversion of the kind of libertarianism that he was pushing, where the GOP establishment was trying to take that energy and filter it into establishment Republicans, similar to what happened with the anti-war movement and the Democratic Party in the mid-2000s. And also with Occupy Wall Street, and that becoming the Bernie Sanders movement, really, of the past few years. On episode 106, I had Dan Jurgens on the show. Dan Jurgens is a comic book writer and artist. I was a really big Superman fan when I was a kid, and Dan Jurgens was writing and drawing a lot of those comics, so it was really great to have him on the show. Again, around that time, I was continuing to have lots of interesting economists on the show. Nicholas Tiedemann, Mason Gaffney, Ted Gortney. They taught me a lot about Georgism and what that's all about. Cynthia McKinney was first on the show on episode 112. And around this time, I also started having guests back pretty regularly. Ajamo Baraka was back on, Ray McGovern was back on, Kevin Carson was back on, Ken Shamrock was back on, Thomas Greco was back on. And then at the start of 2018, I tried doing something a little bit different. I tried changing what this show was or how I was doing it. I guess sort of similar to what Stephen Colbert was doing in the mid-2000s, how he was lampooning and satirizing conservatives. I wanted to do that with neoliberals and neoconservatives and just the establishment corporate media. I wanted to do interviews like an establishment corporate media figure, but having guests on who would never be on the corporate media. Again, very similar to what Stephen Colbert was doing before he actually became the character that he was satirizing. So if you ever go back and listen to episodes 123, 124, and 125 of the show, you'll see me doing it satirically. But what I learned in episode 125 with Ellen Brown is that when you're having these really nuanced, long format conversations, especially about economics and philosophy, it's really, really hard to do that satirically. It's hard, first of all, just when you're doing an interview, it's hard to think about, how you're phrasing things and kind of, again, the nuance that you want to provide and the angle that you want to kind of go at things in. So when you're trying to do that satirically, the reverse way, it's almost impossible. And it's hard to get to points and just delve into thoughts really without coming off as a jackass, I guess, if you're doing it satirically. So I only did it for a few episodes, but it's something that, I find interesting if you were to go back to that short period of the show in January 2018. It was a little fun to kind of toy around with that format for a little while. Around episode 130, I started having bigger musical guests on pretty regularly. I had Jeff Pilson on the show in episode 130. He is the guitarist for Foreigner. I also had Paul Nelson on the show, also Eddie the Chief Clearwater, who was a legendary blues musician. Martin Barr, who is the longtime guitarist for Jethro Tull, he was on episode 137, and that was great to have him on. I'm a huge fan of Jethro Tull, so it was just awesome to speak with him. Episode 138, I had Jim Mccarty on the show. He's the longtime drummer and a founding member of the Yardbirds. On episode 141, I had Fido Della Parra. He was the longtime drummer for Canned Heat. So again, it was just amazing to have these rock and roll Hall of Famers and just these huge figures in music history on this show, and that meant a lot to me. At the same time, I was also having political and economic guests on the show. Larry Sharp, who is a pretty prominent libertarian figure, he was on episode 134. Stephanie Kelton, who is a well-known economist, she was on episode 136. And then episode 140 was a real honor to me to have Matt Taibbi on the show. I've been a huge Matt Taibbi fan for years. I was buying his books in the mid-2000s. I remember I'd always loved watching the episodes of Real Time with Bill Maher whenever Matt Taibbi was on. So it was great to have him on the show on episode 140. Have him on to debunk Russiagate, also talk about Syria and about Facebook, and it was just an amazing conversation. I was so thankful that I finally was able to have Matt Taibbi on the show, and I'm thankful that he's been on several times since then. He's just been a great guest and a wonderful person. I mean, one of the episodes I did with him later on was filmed at his apartment. He was kind enough to have me come over and meet with him. And he signed a bunch of books for me. So just Matt Taibbi is one of the greatest guests in PRIMO Nutmeg history. And I'm really deeply thankful for all that he has done for the show. Episode 142, I had another pretty prominent person on the show, Glenn Jacobs, who is known to WWE fans as Kane, former WWE champion. He was on the show in episode 142. We talked about both politics and professional wrestling. And then episode 144, I finally had Noam Chomsky back on the show. So again, the first time that he was on, I recorded at MIT in 2016 on episode 24. And then the second time he was on the show was in July of 2018, and that was episode 144. That's when he had finally relocated to Arizona. So I flew out to Arizona and did this interview with him in person on video. And I think that's when I started really getting a lot of people subscribing to this show. There was one clip in particular of him talking about Russiagate, which got hundreds of thousands of views. So I think that was really important to the history of the show. Pretty soon thereafter, I had Abby Martin on. That was also a very popular episode. I also had another musical guest on pretty shortly thereafter, Steve Fossen. He's one of the co-founders of the rock and roll band Heart. I also had another comic book person, Derek Robertson, on the show. He's an artist that worked on the series Transmetropolitan, which is one of the best comic book series in the history of comic books. It's essentially if you took Hunter S. Thompson, who again is my favorite writer, if you took him and transport him into the future, into like this cyberpunk future, that's what Transmetropolitan is. And it's a wonderful, amazing comic book series. I think it's 62 issues. So if you're ever going to read one comic book, make it Transmetropolitan. That's my recommendation. Richard Wolff was on the show for the first time in episode 155. Aaron Mate was on the show for the first time on episode 163. Aaron Mate, again, is just a great journalist. He actually has won awards for debunking Russiagate. So it was wonderful to have him on just to kind of go through all the nuances of what Russiagate was and just have him go point by point. This is why that was bullshit. This is why that was bullshit. This is why that was bullshit. And as we all know, it was complete bullshit and it's been debunked over and over again. Then in March of 2019, I decided to do something called Megastar March. And the idea was to have the biggest guests in Primo Nutmeg history back on the show. So episode 166 was with Jim Mccarty. Episode 167 was with Matt Taibbi. Episode 168 was with Jeff Pilson. Episode 169 was with Noam Chomsky again. This was the last time that I interviewed Noam Chomsky. I flew down to Arizona again, met with him. And once again, a big part of the conversation was about Russiagate. And there was a clip from that. Again, got hundreds of thousands of views. And I think this is when a lot of you folks who are listening now, this is probably about the time that you subscribed to the show, episode 169, because that was really a big deal. I think that's the most viewed single episode in this show's history also, and probably the episode that got the most subscribers. Episode 170 was with Ron Paul, and then I didn't actually plan this, and she hadn't been on the show previously, but episode 171 is when I first had Tulsi Gabbard on the show. So I had driven up to New Hampshire a couple times around February and March and seen her speak in person, and then she finally agreed to an interview towards the end of March where she was speaking at some library, and I think she did some other interviews that day. She actually met with Michael Tracy right after me, and I think she spoke with Vice News also. But she sat down with me for about 20 minutes and we had a really good conversation. And it was really an honor to have that caliber of a political figure on the show. You know, I'd had Green Party candidates and sort of these, independent folks on, but a really well-known Democratic figure like Tulsi Gabbard, to have her on the show in episode 171, that did mean a lot to the show. And I know later on, I kind of pissed some Tulsi Gabbard fans off when I got upset about her endorsing Joe Biden. But I do have to be thankful for Tulsi for speaking with me on more than one occasion. She really did help grow this show. I think that her message throughout the campaign was very important. She was a very important voice to have in this campaign. She said things that nobody else would, certainly that Bernie Sanders wouldn't. So I think that she did a great job, but I mean, I maintain she did the absolute wrong thing endorsing Joe Biden. That's a whole nother discussion, but right after that, in episode 172, I had Jill Stein. So I think that series of guests on the show, especially 169 to 172, Noam Chomsky, Ron Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, Jill Stein, I think having those back to back, that really brought a lot of people to the show really quickly. And I think that March into April of 2019, that's when this show got big. That's when a lot of people subscribed. That's when I crossed, 10,000 subscribers. And when I started becoming fairly well known, at least in the Twitter sphere. So I think it was partly luck. It was partly timing. It's just the way things worked out. And again, I mean, 3 of those 4 guests had been on the show before. I'd done 2 other interviews with Noam Chomsky. I had done, I think, 3 others with Ron Paul, 3 others with Jill Stein. But just, again, having that sequence like that, I think that brought a lot of people to the show really quickly and kind of gave this impression that the show was able to have big-name guests on very consistently, back to back to back. Episode 175 was my interview with Howie Hawkins. I really, at this point, don't have much to say about Howie Hawkins and the whole Green Party thing. I think it's just, it's a travesty. Maybe I'll get back to that in a minute, but I appreciate the fact that Howie Hawkins was on the show. I'm glad that we got to get into the subjects that we got to get into, that I was able to make those well known to people. And similarly, episode 178 is when I first had Mike Gravel on the show. Now, in my mind, the Howie Hawkins story and the Mike Gravel story are very closely related. And in fact, as many of you know, there was an instance later on where Mike Gravel's staff had essentially sent out an email telling people to donate to Howie Hawkins, who was not yet the Green Party nominee, keep in mind, asking people in Mike Gravel's name to donate to Howie Hawkins. And then I had Mike Gravel kind of say, I don't know who Howie Hawkins is, and my staff can do whatever they want. But in my mind, there's a very kind of similar thread here of people on the left trying to manipulate others, trying to control the narrative, trying to obfuscate things. And I kind of followed both these stories in a similar fashion, just trying to get to what the truth was, trying to get the truth out there, and trying to get by sort of just gatekeepers and gaslighters and people that try to control the way, the lens that things are viewed through. And I think I had varying success with both of those, but I think in both cases, I was able to get people to recognize that the official story of Howie Hawkins and the official story of @Mike Gravel, they were not really the truth of what was going on. Episode 183 was really a fun one to record. That was with Timothy DeNevy. He wrote a biography on Hunter S. Thompson. So I got to speak with him for a while about Hunter S. Thompson, and then I also got to utilize my friend Rob to record some pieces of Hunter S. Thompson's literature that I really enjoyed. And then also I edited in some recordings with Hunter S. Thompson from other interviews that he did. Episode 185, I had Lee Camp on the show. I met with him at a Green Party event, and we had a pretty good discussion. Nico House was on episode 186. Episode 187 is when Mike Gravel was back on to debunk this whole idea that he was endorsing just Bernie Sanders. So I think that most of you are familiar with this. I'll just quickly recap for those of you who might not be. Essentially, the reason Mike Gravel ran for president last year is that these teenagers reached out to him and wanted him to run. Now, the way that Mike Gravel tells it, from the beginning, the idea was that he wasn't going to win and that he would eventually endorse Bernie Sanders. So in my mind, and again, I just have to clarify, this is my mind, this is pure speculation. In my mind, these teenagers, they were Bernie Sanders supporters and they were also fans of Mike Gravel, and they seemed to think that Mike Gravel would be a good means to an end of helping bolster support for Bernie Sanders. Again, that's my speculation. That's my subjective point of view. I'm not saying that's definitely what happened, but that's what, to me, seemed like was the case. And that's kind of the way that Mike Gravel tells it. Now, over the course of the campaign, Mike Gravel was drawn to Tulsi Gabbard, and he became a fan of what she was saying. Mike Gravel is a very, very anti-war person. He's the person who read the Pentagon Papers into the public record. In the 2008 debates, he called out Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Joe Biden as warmongers. And Mike Gravel is a great figure in American history. He's a hero. So when he was going through the course of the campaign, he recognized, Bernie Sanders doesn't have the best foreign policy. Tulsi Gabbard does. So for that reason, what he decided to do in August of 2019 was endorse both Bernie Sanders, because he had agreed to, and also Tulsi Gabbard, either one for president, either one for vice president. He wanted them to run together. One has a good foreign policy, one has a good domestic policy. What happened, though, is that his campaign was not fans of Tulsi Gabbard. They did not like her. So they essentially tried to obfuscate the fact that Mike Gravel was endorsing Tulsi Gabbard equally to Bernie Sanders. And there was a famous Twitter video that was heavily edited that was put up, and all these different news outlets did reports on it. Mike Gravel endorses Bernie Sanders. Mike Gravel endorses Bernie Sanders. It was this big thing, insofar as the Mike Gravel campaign was a big thing in the news. That was the story. Mike Gravel was dropping out and he was endorsing Bernie Sanders. So I had Mike Gravel on the show. We talked about it. He explained it. And, it was limited media coverage. CBS News did credit me and this interview that I did with Mike Gravel as saying, he later clarified he's endorsing both equally. So I think this was really a good piece of journalism on my part to give myself a pat on the back to help set the record straight. And really, this is the reason that I have always been drawn to journalism, because I don't know if you folks have ever experienced this, but if there's ever a story about something that you care about or something that you're personally familiar with, maybe like in your local news, and you read that story, more often than not, you will find something that isn't really quite right. They got the story a little wrong. They misrepresented something. They didn't really investigate something. They overlooked something. It's just, there's a lot of like vagueness. And the reason why is because more often than not, the journalists are just lazy. They're hacks. They go to work. They just want to get through work, blah, blah, blah. They type something up that they see on Twitter, and they don't really know or care about the story at all. At all. And they're just trying to hit a deadline and get a paycheck. And it's really hard because when an entire industry is doing that, it is so hard to get the truth out there. And that's really what has motivated me a lot of the times. I mean, honestly, like there have been times when I've just been burnt out on the show, and we're going to get to that in a second. But there have been times when I've really been burnt out on the show, and I just come across something like that that gets me so pissed off that the truth is not being represented at all, and that it's just this avalanche of bullshit, of falseness, and just not that it's necessarily, fake news or the opposite of what's happening, but it's propaganda. It's things being shaped and molded and represented in a certain way to benefit certain interests. And I hate that so much. I just wish that we could get transparency and get the truth out there so that people can understand what's happening. But that's the problem with the media in the US, is that it is nearly impossible for the truth to ever get out there. The point of the media, it almost seems, is to misrepresent things. And again, sometimes it's on purpose. I mean, when it's big things, like Russiagate or the Iraq War, it's definitely on purpose. It's to manipulate the public. That it's the CIA trying to do it. But in other cases, it's really just laziness. It's the fact that the industry sucks. It's it's all about making a paycheck and hitting deadlines. And again, what's really motivated me over the years is trying to break through that and just trying to get the truth out there to some people. I know I'm not the biggest YouTube channel or the biggest Twitter account. I've only got, I think, 22,000 subscribers on YouTube and 15,000 or 16,000 Twitter followers. And I'm really thankful that there are people out there who are listening. So thank you all for being receptive to the truth and wanting to know the truth, because a lot of people they don't care. When I was doing this whole Howie Hawkins thing and trying to expose what was happening in the Green Party, most people just don't care. They just don't. And I was reaching out to all kinds of independent journalists, people who have been on the show in the past, and just trying to explain what was happening, A, with Howie Hawkins and his shitty foreign policy, but B, with what was happening in the Green Party and the rigging of the Green Party and some of the, strange conflicts of interest and, things that may be a little suspicious about people in the leadership of the Green Party, and trying to get them to care about it. And people just don't care sometimes. Sometimes they're like, well, the Green Party doesn't really matter. It's a non-factor. It doesn't matter if Jill Stein is the nominee or if Howie Hawkins is the nominee or who's the nominee. It just doesn't really matter. So sometimes it's hard to get people to even care. So thank you all for caring. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being receptive to the truth. That's been really important over the years. So the first episode that I did of this past season of August 2019 to August 2020 was with Richard Wolff. I got to meet with Richard Wolff in Manhattan, sit down for over 2 hours and just go over Marxist economics and politics, and it was amazing. And I am deeply thankful for Richard Wolff being on this show a couple times and really helping grow the audience for this program. He's a really friendly guy. He's very nice and just very personable. And, he's one of those people that it's great to see him get the kind of success that he's gotten and get the kind of audience that he's gotten, because he's such a friendly, nice person. So again, thank you to Richard Wolff. Similar to that, the very next episode, Vermin Supreme. I met with Vermin Supreme. This is probably the oddest interview I've ever done. I met with him essentially in the woods of some small town in Massachusetts, and then we went over to a boat dock. So if you watch this thing, he's sitting at a picnic table with the boot on his head. He's sitting at a picnic table in front of where all these boats are docked, And we're there in the middle of the night just talking. I think the cops drove by at one point to see what we were doing, but we're just doing this interview at like midnight or something. And that was an interesting interview. And I'm always going to look back on that fondly. Episode 194 is when Jesse Ventura was first on the show, and it was great to finally have him on. He's one of the people who, from the beginning, he's one of the people who I wanted to have on the show because when I first started, again, I really wasn't too politically focused specifically. I mean, it was a big component of this show, but I'm really interested in professional wrestling, or at least was in the past, movies and music, and it was so cool to have somebody who spanned a bunch of different worlds in Jesse Ventura. Someone who was in the Mongols, someone who was a wrestler and an announcer in the WWF, somebody who was an actor, somebody who was the governor of Minnesota, somebody who has worked in the media. He has had so many different careers, and he's such an interesting person, and he's somebody who I want to have on the show for so long, and I was finally able to on episode 194. And that's when I also was able to ask him about running for president, and he first floated the idea of running with the Green Party, and he also mentioned Robert F. Kennedy as a potential running mate. So it was wonderful to finally have him on the show in episode 194. Episode 196, Katie Halper was on the show. That was also awesome because I'm a big fan of her show, so it was really cool to have her on. And then episode 200, that's when Jimmy Dore was on the show. And that was wonderful for the big 200th episode. Finally, Jimmy Dore, again, somebody who was really an inspiration to me and who really had opened my eyes to what bullshit Russiagate was. Just to have this guy on the show meant so much to me. And it was a long interview. It was 45 minutes, 47 minutes. So I could not be more thankful for Jimmy Dore and what he's done for the show and being on the show so many times, especially on that 200th episode. I think a lot of you other folks who may not have subscribed when Noam Chomsky was on, I think maybe you came over when Jimmy Dore was on episode 200. So again, big shout out and thank you to Jimmy Dore for all that you've done for this show. Episode 202, I had Oliver Stone on. So I flew out to Los Angeles, sat down with Oliver Stone in his office, and we talked for 48 minutes about his career. That was amazing. It was so great to meet him in person. I am a huge fan of so many Oliver Stone movies. I think his films have really shaped the way that I see the world very deeply, and his documentary series as well. He's just an amazing figure, and it was such an honor to meet with him in person. And also, as you folks know, the last episode of the show, he was just back on. So again, thank you to Oliver Stone. You've also done so much for the show, and it really means a lot to me. On episode 204, I actually had two guests. Matt Taibbi and Aaron Mate were back on the show, and they helped debunk Russiagate together. It was wonderful to get the two to speak to each other and play off each other and answer questions at the same time. I really enjoyed that interview, again, with two of my journalistic heroes. On episode 205, I had Robbie Yeager on to discuss the Young Turks and how the Young Turks has been corrupted by money. On episode 206, George Galloway was on. That was the last episode of 2019. George Galloway is a hero of British politics, so it was wonderful to have him on the show. And at the start of this year, I had many guests back on the show. Mike Gravel was back on. Ron Paul was back on. Ron Yukalik was on for the first time. Jimmy Dore was back on. Michael Tracy was on for the first time. So was Brianna Gray and Margaret Kimberly. And then I had several of the Green Party candidates on, as well as Joseph Kishore, who's running with the Socialist Equality Party. Then on episode 220, which happened back in June, Jesse Ventura was back on the show to discuss his run for president. And again, this goes back to the whole Howie Hawkins thing. And I think maybe it wasn't made clear enough on this show exactly what happened. And, it's kind of hard to say things when you're in the media without risking any kind of legal lawsuits. I've actually been privy to some emails that have been flying back and forth behind the scenes about people, different parties that have been in contact with Jesse Ventura, some of them threatening to sue each other. So, that's one of the things about being in the media is that, unfortunately, as much as I would like to say all the things that need to be said, I can't for legal reasons because then I'm going to have some jackass threatening to sue me for defaming him. But overall, I think I can say Jesse Ventura was not given an adequate chance to run for the Green Party nomination. I think that he was fed false information. I think that there was a concerted effort to not only keep him out of the race, but also to ensure that Howie Hawkins was going to be the nominee. Now, you can get into all kinds of theories as to why people want Howie Hawkins to be the nominee. I have my own sort of conspiracy theories as to why you would want somebody who is very uncharismatic and who is not going to connect with the average voter, why you would want him to be the Green Party nominee, why you would take somebody who has lost over 20 elections and want him to be the nominee, as opposed to Jesse Ventura, somebody who won the governorship of Minnesota by beating both a Democrat and a Republican, someone who is a household name, someone who would not only get to the 5% that the Green Party so desperately wants, but somebody who also theoretically could win the 2020 election. When you look at two candidates as bad as Donald Trump and Joe Biden, it's not hard to see how most people do not want to vote for either of those men. Both men have been accused of sexual crimes. Both men are warmongers. Both men believe in a police state. And both men will put the interests of Wall Street above the American people. Jesse Ventura is not like either of those men. And Jesse Ventura could win. So that's why I was happy to have him on the show, and it was really great to have him break the news that he is writing his own name in for president, and folks out there can also write his name in too. But it was sad to hear how, because of his health insurance concerns and also because of just things that he was told about the Green Party race, that he was not able to win that nomination, and that the nomination was allegedly rigged for Howie Hawkins. Since then, folks, of course, you know that I've had George Galloway back on the show, Jimmy Dore back on the show. Ben Norton was just on the show for the very first time. It was awesome to have him as a guest and to talk about a wide variety of subjects. And then, as I just mentioned on the last episode of this program, Primo Nutmeg number 226, Oliver Stone was back on to discuss his new book. So, ladies and gentlemen, that has been the last 5 years of Primo Nutmeg. Just took me a little while to run through all of that. But again, it's really interesting to kind of look at the evolution of the show, not just my logo and my taglines and the kind of branding of the show, but also just to look at the evolution of what it was when I first started out versus what it is now. Again, when I first started out, when I first sat down in a basement for episode 1 with my friends, I really just wanted to talk about different things. I just wanted to have interesting conversations with interesting people. I think I've maintained that same basic spirit over the years, but it also has really become more of a strictly interview show where I have a celebrity on the program or somebody who's relevant to a story, and I just kind of ask them questions. And while that's fine, and I'm glad that it can be educational, I am starting to reach the point now where I am starting to get burnt out again. There have been a couple periods in the history of this show where I took breaks. And I'm coming to the point now again where I feel like I need to go on hiatus for a while. Now, I'm sure it's frustrating for listeners who like to listen to the show regularly to have these long periods where I kind of go on break. But I just want to share that, when I first started out doing the show, I was a single guy. And I worked at jobs that didn't necessarily matter if I lost or, it wasn't that big of a concern for me at the time. I'm now married, I have a child, and even though I work from home most of the days of the week at my current job, it's still just a constant distraction, to be honest with you. One kind of regret that I have, or I guess goal that I have not been able to achieve with this show, is that it is not a reliable source of income for me. Now, that's not to say that I don't make any money off the show. I do get a little bit of money from YouTube. This year it's been not that great. Honestly, it's been about $100 a month if I'm lucky. I also get support from you patrons out there. And again, I have to thank you for your years of support. You guys have been a major help in keeping this show going. But unfortunately, it's just not enough money to survive on at all. Now, that's not to say that when I started out, I wanted this show to be something that I could do full time. But at this point in my life, my family needs to come first, and I need to think about what's best for them. And I think that this show, again, while I really love doing it, and while I'm glad can provide some benefit to the community, I think maybe at times it distracts me from my family or from my job that provides for my family. And unfortunately, that's not something that I'm that enthusiastic about doing at this moment. Also, to be perfectly honest, I'm a little burnt out just having to kind of deal with certain things For example, this whole Howie Hawkins escapade has just been really daunting and really tiresome. It's been such a struggle to even get the story out about what has happened over this past year with the Green Party nomination, to educate people on who these people are behind the scenes, how the Green Party operates. And you have so many people out there who just hate the Republicans and hate the Democrats so much, and justifiably so, to try to educate them on what's been happening with the Green Party too. It's been so tiresome. And then you get attacked by all these people online who are Howie Hawkins supporters. Maybe they're in his campaign, maybe they're not. And it's just not fun, It's just not really that fun. And honestly, overall, this election has just been one disappointment after another. I think that's really the sad story of the 2020 election, is that when it started out, there was so much potential for it to be a revolutionary election. And if you just go down the list from how the Democratic nomination turned out and what a disappointment Bernie Sanders was and what a disappointment Tulsi Gabbard was, and then even to the other candidates like Mike Gravel and how his message was manipulated, and to Howie Hawkins and everything that happened with the Green Party, and then also with Jesse Ventura and his seeming unwillingness to really jump in the race in a meaningful way. This election has been so, so disappointing. Then you couple that with everything that's been going on with COVID and the protests that have been happening, and you start to wonder, is there even going to be an election? What is going to happen in the next few months? Is there a potential for martial law? And overall, it just gets to the point where you don't want to cover politics anymore, at least at the moment. So with that, folks, I do have to announce that I am going to be going on hiatus. I'm going to be taking a break from this show after the next episode, but I do have one final big guest who's going to be on the show next week. So please do mark your calendars for the final episode of PRIMO Nutmeg before the hiatus. This is going to be next week, episode 228, with Tara Reid. Now, for those of you who don't know, Tara Reid is the woman who has come forward to accuse Joe Biden of sexually assaulting her back in 1993. I wanted to have her on the show to tell the story of what has happened since she's come forward, how she's been smeared and libeled in the media, and how she's been accused of being a Russian agent. I really think that Tara Reid, beyond being a victim of the sexual assault of Joe Biden, is also a victim of the neo-McCarthyism that we're living under today. So it's really an honor and a privilege for me to have Tara Reid on the show next week to tell her story. So again, please do mark your calendars. Next weekend, the weekend of the 22nd, I'm going to have Tara Reid on the show, and she's going to tell her story. But after that, folks, I am going to be going on hiatus. I'm going to be taking a break. I don't know how long it'll be. It could be through the end of the election. It could be into 2021. To paraphrase Shawn Michaels, for you wrestling fans out there, I've lost my smile. And I just want to kind of take a break and, do things I enjoy and not think about politics and not be disappointed in what's happening to our country for a little while. That's the thing, too, is, when you're into the news, when you follow the news and you follow politics and you follow the media, it's just really sad. It's heartbreaking to see how things keep getting worse and how there's so many well-meaning people out there and how they keep getting fooled by politicians and by the media. The truth is that as horrible as Donald Trump and Joe Biden are, their supporters are mostly good people. The Donald Trump folks out there, they really want to make this country better. Again, make America great again. That's what they want. Now, I know there's a tinge of racism in that message, but I don't honestly believe that all of Donald Trump's supporters are racist. I think that they are people who recognize how this country is going downhill, and they recognize how terrible the Democratic Party is, and they really voted for Trump in 2016 to blow up the system. Unfortunately, and this should be obvious, Donald Trump is not a revolutionary candidate. Nor does he even really stand for everything that he says he does. He's not really against war. And he's not really even for our country. Between the US and Israel, what country does Donald Trump put first? The same can be said of Joe Biden. I think that most people who support Joe Biden are well-meaning. I think that they recognize the dangers of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and they want more for this country and more for their families. The problem is that they are getting manipulated into supporting a blue tie version of Donald Trump. And similarly, I think that most Green Party supporters are well-meaning people, I think that they don't even really know who Howie Hawkins is or how the Green Party operates. And I think that that's by design. I think that there is a real strong push to keep people out of the internal process of the Green Party. You aren't supposed to really know how Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers and Andrea Merida, how they operate in the Green Party, what they do. You're not supposed to understand what the PCSC does and how all these different committees work and operate. That's not really important for you as the public. The important thing for them is that you donate to them and that they can rely on you to vote one way or another, I would say another, in November. And the same thing can be said of the Libertarian Party. I think that there are a lot of really well-meaning libertarians out there. I think that they believe in individual rights. They think that the world could be a more peaceful place if people just operated voluntarily. Unfortunately, they're also being misled into effectively supporting giant corporations. And I'll give you one example of that. A year or two back, there was a big purge by the different social media giants working in conjunction. So Facebook, Twitter, Google, they cooperated to ban a bunch of pages, and many of those were libertarian pages. Now, you would think that libertarians out there would be outraged, but a lot of them stood behind the corporations and said, well, they're private entities, so they can do whatever they want. The problem with libertarians is they don't recognize how giant corporations, and again, who incorporates corporations? It's the state. How these legal fictions, who are not people, who rely on the state to reinforce what they are, how they can oppress people as well. And just the nuance of that seems really lost on a lot of libertarians, where they just think, well, there's public and there's private. There's the state that relies on taxation, and they're a band of thieves, and then there are these private voluntary organizations like Facebook and Google and Twitter, and that is fucking not true, okay? Facebook and Google and Twitter and these giant corporations. Are you telling me that Boeing isn't part of the government? Are you telling me that Comcast isn't part of the government? They're the mouthpiece of the CIA. And that's really overall what I'm kind of just getting frustrated by with politics, is these different cliques and just dogmas and people kind of just embracing certain beliefs to fit in with certain crowds who, again, they're doing it for the right reasons, but it just creates this endless loop where the same people stay in power. They just change what their messaging is slightly to keep people believing in this big scheme to ruin our country and ruin the world. So anyway, after 5 years of covering that, I just, I don't know, I need to take a break. And that's what I'm going to do. So after my Tara Reid interview next week, I'm going to be going on a hiatus. Again, I don't know how long it's going to be. It may be a month, it may be 2 months. It may actually depend on what happens in the news. If there's something really important that I think is worth covering, like maybe Ghislaine Maxwell dies in prison, well, maybe I'll come back and do an episode about that. But overall, I just want to kind of get my own house in order. I want to do things that make sense for my family. I want to do things that I enjoy. I just kind of want to not feel like I have to make an episode of Primo Nutmeg every week. So in any case, I just think it's best to take a break for a while, take a breather, kind of figure things out. And yeah, I'm sorry if that's disappointing to some of you folks out there. I will be disabling my Patreon in the interim over the next few weeks. I'll let that play out through the end of this month, and then I'll turn it off just so that I'm not making money off people while I'm not doing any content. And I will be updating everyone when I do come back. If you'd like to make sure that you do get notified, please do go to PRIMONUTMEG.com and sign up for the mailing list. You just have to type in your email address, and then as soon as I am back on, I'll be sending out an email letting everyone know. But again, after next week's show, please don't expect there to be any new content for at least a month or two, if not into next year. With all that being said, I did want to answer some patron questions today. So I asked my patrons if they had any questions for me. I wanted to go through each of those. And again, I just want to thank all of my patrons for supporting this show. I believe when I first started Patreon, it was when my show was demonetized completely by YouTube. YouTube decided to demonetize my channel back at the start of 2018, and throughout most of the year, my show was 100% demonetized. I still have many, many videos that are themselves demonetized, but it was great that during that time, I was able to start a Patreon, and all of you folks out there were able to help support the show, and that helped keep me going and reach this 5-year mark. So again, thank you all for all of your support. It's amazing to me. You know, when I started out, First of all, I didn't think anybody was going to listen. Second of all, I didn't think I'd be getting celebrities on the show. Third of all, I didn't think that people would actually be paying money to support my show and keep it going. So again, thank you all for all of your support. It really does mean a lot. So I just want to go through and answer each of these patron questions. Paula Schaefer said, what motivated you to do this? What is your background? Well, Paula, I think I may have covered that a little bit so far, explaining how I got started with my radio show. Prior to that, I did student journalism and independent journalism for years. So back when I was in high school, I was really one of the most motivated people on my high school newspaper. There was one edition that came out where I had written the majority of the stories and where I also had done both of the comic strips on the back of the newspaper. So, I've always been very, very interested in journalism. It's something that is just a passion for me. I did that in high school, I did that in college, and I also did that after I graduated doing independent journalism. As I mentioned, I interviewed Noam Chomsky 2 times, I believe, prior to doing this show. So I've always really been drawn to doing journalism and independent journalism, not being part of the corporate media. I have done hack pieces for some local newspapers and also have had some columns published in some fairly big newspapers. And that's actually how I got to see how the media operates from the inside, is writing those local news pieces. Essentially, an editor will say, hey, I need you to cover this and this and this week. There are things that you're probably not interested in, and you have a deadline, and in order to keep working for the paper and get paid, you have to quickly find out about something and do a write-up. So basically what you do typically is you go to an event, you talk to some people, you write it up, and you provide it by the end of the day so that they can report on it tomorrow. And basically, at least in my experience, that's what a reporter is nowadays. It's somebody who has a limited experience with something and writes it up. And that's actually head and shoulders above the people who you see on TV, because those people are not reporters, they're not journalists, they're just teleprompter readers. Rachel Maddow, for example, do you think she actually does any journalism? No. She tells some of her staff, hey, look into this and this and this. And then they go out, they write up stuff, and then she sits there and she reads the screen. Same thing with anybody in the corporate media. So I've never really been interested in the corporate media, honestly. As I mentioned, I'm a big fan of Hunter S. Thompson. I think that he really did journalism on his own terms and changed journalism to a large degree through his revolutionary work. So that's always been my dream, to be sort of a gonzo journalist, to find out the truth on my own terms. Again, that's really why I'm a big fan of Transmetropolitan. I think that comic book series really sums up what it means to be a journalist and what the pursuit of truth is like. So because of that, and again, just because of the fact that I had been doing some radio and my friends were doing podcasting, that's really what caused me to start doing this. And again, I'm going to be going on hiatus just again because I can't manage it at the moment. It's too much. It's too much work, not enough return. And I'm coming to the point too where I can't find myself really seeing what the goal is anymore. I think this show has wildly succeeded beyond what I could have hoped for it. I never thought that I'd be interviewing people like Jesse Ventura or Oliver Stone and that they'd be repeat guests on my show. I never thought that people would be paying to hear me. I never thought that I'd have thousands and thousands of followers online who would regularly follow me. So I'm happy that I've been able to shed light on things which I think otherwise would have really gone underreported. However, all of that being said, I'm still not really sure what the next step is or what the next end game is. Also, and I didn't mention this earlier, but I really think that the oxygen is going to get eaten up by the presidential election over the next few months. Everything you're going to hear is Trump and Biden and Kamala Harris and Mike Pence, and that's really it. It's about the November election between the Republicans and the Democrats, and I don't care anymore. I don't want to go through that again. 2016 was such a shit show. So many people compromising their integrity for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and people just getting mad at each other. Like, do you remember back on Facebook, families fighting with each other? And I lost at least one friend because of the 2016 election, because they were upset that I was responsible for Hillary Clinton losing because I wasn't supportive of her. And it's just like, I don't care. It's dumb. It's a stupid, idiotic game between two parties who are really one party that are controlled by the same exact interest, pushing the same exact agenda with different flavors. And I just don't care. And obviously, I think the Green Party is bullshit at the moment too. So there's no end game in it for me at the moment, and I just want out at least for a little while. I'm taking my chips. I'm gonna sit out the next few hands. You guys have fun. Please listen to Lee Camp and Jimmy Dore and Katie Halper and Matt Taibbi and Rania Khalek. I think that all of these different folks, they have a great perspective. I don't really know if I could add much to the conversation beyond what they're doing. But yeah, that's what motivated me to start doing this show, and those are the reasons why I'm taking a break. So Greg asks, who are some interviews you've really been wanting but haven't been able to get? So again, I just want to say Oliver Stone and Jesse Ventura are two who I never thought I would be able to get. It was so much work. I mean, honestly, I tried for years to get Jesse Ventura on the show. It was very, very hard work. And I finally was able to last fall, and I'm thankful that I was able to get him back on the show a couple months ago. So that was a dream come true. And then Oliver Stone, similarly. And, one of the funny things, I think some of you may know this, I've considered changing the name of the show at certain times just because PRIMO Nutmeg is kind of weird and not that professional. But I remember one time I was reaching out publicly to Oliver Stone because I couldn't get a response via email. So reaching out publicly over Twitter, trying to get his attention, and somebody said to me, he'll never be on a show called PRIMO Nutmeg. And what was amazing for me when he was finally on the show is that he said, well, somebody called PRIMO Nutmeg, that's somebody who I need to talk to. So I thought that was funny, and it was really cool that I got to have him on the show. Again, flying out to Los Angeles, sitting in Oliver Stone's offices and interviewing him, that's just amazing. That's a dream come true. So I have to say those have been ones that I worked very hard towards and finally got. As far as some who I have not been able to get, Ric Flair is a professional wrestler who is a hero of mine. I've actually met him on a few different occasions. And I think one time when I met him, I was asking him to be on the show. Unfortunately, I think WWE really does not want their people doing interviews. Another wrestler actually told me that. So I think it's really hard to get WWE talent, especially if they have any kind of current relationship with WWE. I think it's very, very difficult to get those people on. So Ric Flair was definitely one who I wish I could have gotten on the show. I think I came close once. He had one agent working with him or something, and I was in contact with her, and she made it sound like it was a possibility, but I think she stopped working for him, so it fell through. So Ric Flair was one. Also, I'm a huge fan of Pink Floyd. They're one of my favorite bands, and Roger Waters definitely is somebody who I'd love to have on the show at some point. I think that the work that he has done bringing to light what has happened to Julian Assange is really important, and I'd love to speak with him about that. Of course, Roger Waters is one of the most famous people on the planet, so it's obviously hard to expect him to come on a show with 20,000 subscribers. Similarly, I really appreciate the work that Pamela Anderson has done speaking out for Julian Assange, and I'd love to have Pamela Anderson on the show. Obviously, I was a kid in the 90s, so she was a crush of mine in the 90s, and I'd love to talk to her about her whole career, but specifically what she's done for Julian Assange, and just hear her thoughts overall on what has been happening to Julian Assange over the last year and a half that he has been imprisoned and tortured. Because he was one of the few people out there who actually had any integrity and wanted the public to know the truth. As far as other folks, it's kind of funny sometimes the people that you have tried for whatever reason to get on the show, but just has been impossible. So there's another wrestler, his name is Sean Morley. He went by the ring name Val Venus. He was kind of a popular wrestler in like 1998, 1999. He had sort of a short stint there where he was pretty well known, solid mid-carder. I think he may have been Intercontinental Champion. And he became a marijuana activist a few years ago. I think he goes by the name Captain Cannabis now. And I just want to have him on the show to discuss his career, his wrestling career, and talk about politics, talk about marijuana. I've reached out to him so many times, and I've gotten a few emails back, but this guy has been near impossible I mean, impossible, because I haven't. He's been impossible to get on this show. He's been impossible. And it's funny to me because I've been able to get Jesse Ventura on the show. I've been able to get Oliver Stone on the show. I've been able to get Noam Chomsky on the show. And all of these people multiple times. For some reason, I cannot get Sean Morley on PRIMO Nutmeg. He is it's hard to reach. And similarly, when I was having all of those different Mighty Morphin Power Rangers on the show, I had all of the surviving original cast besides Austin St. John. He was the Red Ranger. He played Jason. And beyond his time on that show, I don't think he's really done that much in entertainment. I could be wrong. Perhaps he's been on some other programs or whatnot, but I reached out to him many times and I was very surprised that he did not want to join all of the other surviving members of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Again, every single other member who was on this show, he did not want to be on the show. So that was odd to me. And beyond that, there are some people like Cornel West. I've reached out to him multiple times. Same thing with Bernie Sanders. It's understandable where he wouldn't be. That's actually how Brianna Gray ended up on the show, because I was trying to get Bernie Sanders on, and she offered to be a surrogate for him. And if he knew who I was, he would probably be thankful that he was on the show, because I would have asked him those questions that I asked Brianna Gray about Russiagate, about Julian Assange. I think that Bernie Sanders really showed a lack of courage. And I agree with people who say he's a sheepdog. He is a sheepdog. He sheepdogged the left twice. The point is to get the left to support the Democratic nominee who is going to be a neoliberal. He has done that twice now. I think that there are things that he says that are correct. I think that he has shown bravery in certain instances, I think especially in the past. But at the end of the day, Bernie Sanders wants to go along with the Democratic establishment. Even as far back as 1999, when he went along with the bombing of Kosovo, he is just willing to help the Democratic establishment and is willing to sell out. And that's the truth about Bernie Sanders. And similarly, that's why I was so disappointed in Tulsi Gabbard, by the way, just because I thought she should have been above that. And I thought that saying Joe Biden is filled with the spirit of aloha, this rapist, senile war criminal, that's insane. And that's really disgusting that you would even say that. So that's why I burned my Tulsi Gabbard shirt. I don't take that back. I don't think I was wrong. I know you people think I was childish, or she agreed to support the Democratic nominee, or blah, blah, blah. No, it's wrong to support Joe Biden. He is a terrible person, and you should not consent to evil. So I'm standing by burning that shirt. So anyway, Greg, I hope that answered your question. I've reached out to a lot of those people. I mean, there are other random people who I reached out to who responded back that they couldn't be on. Dore Funk Jr., his brother Terry Funk is somebody who I reached out to, but I don't think I ever heard back from. Joseph Stiglitz was one. There are all kinds of people who I've reached out to, and either they said they weren't available at the time. There are people who I just hear back from their agents. I've tried many times. Chris Hedges I tried to have on to ask him why he would support Howie Hawkins. I think at the end of the day, that's because of his relationship with Margaret Flowers and Kevin Zeese. But I reached out to Chris Hedges many times, and only his agent will respond to me. Same thing with Penn Jillette. I think since I started, I've been trying to have Penn Jillette on the show, and his agent will just write back saying he's not available. Bill Burr is another person who I've reached out to many times, and his agent either ignores me or tells me he's not available. So I've been at this for 5 years. So there's a lot of people, essentially. The reason, here's the reason too, because I've been asked this many times. I always get asked, how do you get so many great interviews? How do you get so many great interviews? And here's the key. You ask everyone. You ask everyone there is to be on your show, and then some of them will say yes. Most of them will say no, or most of them will at least ignore you for a while. But if you ask lots and lots of people, and you keep asking the people who you never hear back from, you will eventually get a lot of those people on your show. And that's been the key to my success. I think it's pretty basic. And that's how I've been able to get so many folks on my show. Next question is from Nick. He says, I think a lot of us were surprised when you let Brianna Joy Gray assert Russiagate skepticism was just for conspiracy theorists. Can you explain your thought process behind how you conducted that interview? Well, I conducted that interview by knowing that I had a limited amount of time and wanting to get 2 questions in that I knew she would not be that receptive to. One of my philosophies in doing my interviews is that I want to let people explain their thought process. I typically don't want to have a very confrontational interview. I like to hear what people's ideas are. That's harder sometimes when people are not being genuine, when they're not acting in good faith. But for example, if you look back to my interview with Howie Hawkins, I let him talk. I asked him questions and I let him talk and I let him talk and I let him talk. So that's typically what I like to do. That's how I think the truth comes out. I'm not going to get the truth from someone if I'm talking over them and berating them and hitting them with a point. So I asked Brianna Joy Gray about Russiagate and I asked her about Julian Assange, and she basically gave non-answers to both of those because she was acting as a surrogate for Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders believes in Russiagate or is willing to push it, and he will not stand up for Julian Assange because, again, Bernie Sanders does not reflect the kind of morality that he should, especially on foreign policy and things like Julian Assange. So that's just, I knew that was how that was going to play out. I wanted to get both questions in and I wanted to let her talk. So that's how I conducted that interview. And I don't think that her answers should have been that much of a surprise because when you're in politics, you have agendas, and she was acting as a surrogate for Bernie Sanders. So I have 3 questions here from Samuel. The first one is, what has been the most significant challenge you faced in creating this platform? Well, the answer to that is it's been very hard getting people to pay attention. And I started this show 5 years ago when there was a lot more room. I've since considered creating different podcasts. Again, so when I first started, this show was very multifaceted. I covered lots of different topics. I was sort of advised and honestly saw in the analytics of looking at my channel that people who listen to this show really are just interested in politics. They don't want to hear from a musician. They don't want to hear from a professional wrestler. They don't want to hear about comic books. These are things that I'm really interested in and drawn towards. My listeners don't care about that stuff. They want this to be a political show. They want this to be another Jimmy Dore. So that being said, I've considered, since I started, creating different channels that would be more focused on other topics. But the challenge there is even with 20,000 subscribers, I don't know if I could get enough people over to a new channel to listen to that. For example, I think Shoe on Head has 2 different channels, and I think on her main channel, she just has infinitely more subscribers than on her auxiliary one. And when you're on YouTube, the goal now is to get over 1,000 subscribers so that you can be monetized. So if I start a new channel, I'm not gonna have any revenue coming in. And again, I barely have any at 20,000 subscribers, but I'm not gonna have a cent coming in until I hit 1,000. Then I can apply to become a member. And there's also other watch time criteria also. So that's held me back from creating a new channel, and that was really the biggest challenge in this show's history, is just getting subscribers. And it was just really an effort of having people on consistently, having famous guests. I'm kind of amazed when I see other channels where it's just a person talking to the screen about politics and they get more subscribers than me. There's one channel that has like 30,000. It's just a guy talking. Like, how do you get that many? Because it's been so much work for me just to get 22,000 subscribers and having these huge name guests on. Now, a big part of that is YouTube hiding my content from people. They definitely do that. You can search YouTube for the title of my videos and I will not show up until the 2nd or 3rd page because they do not like my content. It's too controversial. It's too outside the box. They want to push everything but my show. So really the challenge has been, I guess, finding an audience and also just dealing with the bullshit of YouTube. And to some degree, Facebook too. Facebook has ads policies where you can't run political ads and blah, blah, blah. So social media censorship overall, I guess, would be the big one. And just trying to find an audience, trying to find a space, and being able to get people who are receptive to what you're trying to get out there. I can't even imagine starting today. I can't imagine starting PRIMO Nutmeg today and trying to get an audience. It would probably take more than 4 or 5 years to get that audience. It would probably take forever. It probably wouldn't even be possible, honestly. I don't know how folks starting out today can really even do it. So the second question Sam has is, which has been the most eye-opening interview you've conducted over the past 5 years? That is a toughie. I find that's often the case when you ask somebody who does something regularly what the best one was, or so on. I asked Bob Backlund that when he was my first celebrity guest. I asked him what was his best match or who was his best opponent, and he couldn't answer those questions. And that's typically the case if you've been doing something for a while. It's really, really hard to pick just one, because you're asking me to look back on 226 episodes. Most of those were interviews and just hours and hours of different conversations covering different things, and trying to think what was the most eye-opening thing. When you ask that, what comes to mind immediately is when I had Thomas Greco on. And forgive me, I don't even know if it's the first interview or the second interview I did with him. I think it might have been the second one. And he was explaining that the growth imperative in capitalism is really because of banks and the interest that banks charge. And that was really something I hadn't thought of before, is that, yeah, these companies need to make money because they owe the banks money. They owe the banks interests. So when we have a currency that is based on debt, where everyone immediately owes the bankers money, then we need to grow like cancer to pay back the debt to the bank. And if you're not able to pay that debt back, then you have this growth imperative that never ends. And that is what's fueling this global financial system of destroying the earth and raping and pillaging. It's because of the bankers. It's because of interest on debt. So that was really something that was very eye-opening to me. Along the same lines, and actually the person who recommended that I have Thomas Greco on the show, Kevin Carson, I really enjoyed my interviews with him. He really helped explain anarchism to me in a way that I was not able to understand before, perhaps. He brought lots of ideas to my mind that I had not thought of before. Also, the same could be said of David Ellerman. David Ellerman is somebody who believes that the employer-employee relationship should be abolished because it is a modern, watered-down form of slavery. I thought that was really interesting, and that was an eye-opening conversation. And that actually goes hand-in-hand with one of the earlier questions, somebody who I haven't had on the show and who I've reached out repeatedly and who I actually had spoken with at one point in the past, is David Graeber. I think David Graeber's work is amazing. He's actually the person who coined the phrase, "We are the 99%." And he's written lots of great books. I read one a year or two ago called Bullshit Jobs, which I recommend to everyone. And it's a shame I never was able to get David Graeber on the show, because I think that would have been a fascinating conversation. But that book is something that was very eye-opening to me, where he talks about how at least half of jobs out there are pointless and there's no reason for them. There's people just shuffling papers. It's things that don't need to be done. And the point is really just to keep people working. So to go back to your question, overall, it's very, very difficult to pick out individual interviews that were extremely eye-opening, but the ones that immediately come to mind are Thomas Greco, Kevin Carson, and David Ellerman. The last question I have is from Jesse, and Jesse says, if the election doesn't result in a winner on election night due to mail-in voting, the U.S. could effectively see two coups in place led by Trump and Biden. Who would you expect to win in that scenario? Also, separate question. Okay, let me get to that first. So, this is really a toughie, because you're effectively asking me to speculate on if Trump and Biden are both going to claim that they won the election. I don't know what would happen in that kind of scenario. It could obviously result in a civil war. That would be probably the worst case scenario. And I don't know who would win a civil war. I'm not sure. I guess it would matter on who had control of the nuclear weapons. But I don't know if you mean just like a legal battle in the court system. I guess it would depend on who the judges were. The Supreme Court is Republican, right? So I guess it would go to Trump, but also Trump, he has Republicans who are against him. like Mitt Romney, for example. So I don't know. I have no idea what's going to happen this November. It's going to be messy, and I don't even know who's likely to win, honestly, because I think Trump has disappointed so many people, but I also think that Joe Biden is such an unlikable candidate, similar to Hillary Clinton, but maybe not as bad. So it's really hard to even predict who's going to win. I mean, it could be Joe Biden. Joe Biden could win, and Donald Trump could dispute the outcome of the election. But if he isn't willing to go to the extent of risking a civil war and calling on his supporters not to go along with the official outcome of the election, it's just hard to see a businessman doing that. It's hard to see. I understand he's an egomaniac, but like, I don't think he's gonna. He's a billionaire. He can just retire. He can go off and live a life that none of us can even dream of. And I don't think that the spectacle that we're seeing is really the truth of the matter. I think that Donald Trump and Joe Biden have a lot of the same friends. I think they answered a lot of the same people. And I think that they are going to, in sort of a professional wrestling-esque way, while seeming to attack each other, I think that they're going to really support a lot of the same sort of ideas. Like, for example, China is trying to interfere in our election. They're both saying that. So I have no clue. I don't know what's going to happen in November. And I don't think it really matters that much, I mean, assuming there is no violence or anything that comes from it. But short of that, I don't think it really matters that much if Joe Biden or Donald Trump are the president. I think there's still going to be wars overseas. I think that corporations are still going to destroy the earth. I think that people are still going to be in debt and unable to pay that debt. I think that the government's going to keep spying on people unconstitutionally. I think that things are generally going to not be that great in either case. So I don't know. And I don't think it matters that much. So the second half of your question, and this should be the end of the questions from the patrons. Also, separate question and thought, but would you have Don Blankenship of the Constitution Party on your show? He has been arguing against the wars and has some interesting perspectives. Again, I had the Constitution Party candidate on in 2016. And I know that there's a lot of folks out there who would say, you're platforming a right-winger and that's not right and yada yada. But again, I'm from the perspective that if you're coming to the debate in good faith, if you're not openly calling for violence against people, if you just have a different perspective on how society should be, and you're not calling for violence against people, and you're not being extremely hostile against people, then I don't think that it's wrong to talk to those people. So yeah, unless he has said some horrible stuff, I honestly don't know much about Mr. Blankenship, but unless he's said some horrible, terrible things that I don't know, then yeah, I would have him on the show. I'd speak with him. But again, the problem with that is I am going to be taking a break. So folks, again, after next week is my big interview with Tara Reid, and it's going to be something that you're not going to want to miss. But after that, I'm going to go on a break. I'm going to sit out the next month or two or 3 or 4 or 5 and just relax and focus on my family and not worry about what I'm going to say about what's on the news this week. Because I'm so sick of the news. I'm so sick of politics. I'm sorry, but it's the truth. I just don't care anymore. And it doesn't matter. It's all bullshit, and it's all meant to manipulate you. It's all meant to get you to support the same policies and the same agendas, and even the opposition is controlled opposition. Democracy Now! And the Young Turks and the Green Party, they do not want to upset the establishment because they're part of the establishment. They're part of the ruse. They're part of the con. And it's daunting to have to point all that out. So I'm going to take a break. Please do tune in next week for my interview with Tara Reid. It's something that you're not going to want to miss. I really am deeply thankful that she's willing to be on the show. And after that, please subscribe to Jimmy Dore. Please subscribe to Ron Placone. Please subscribe to Lee Camp. Please subscribe to Katie Halper and her show with Matt Taibbi, Useful Idiots. Please subscribe to the Moderate Rebels and to the Gray Zone. All of those outlets I think are wonderful. Please also subscribe to George Galloway's show, the mother of all talk shows. That's a wonderful program. So please subscribe to all of those different channels and know that I do look forward to coming back. I do look forward to finding my smile, and I look forward to continuing Primo Nutmeg down the road. And folks, again, please do not forget next weekend, my big interview with Tara Reid. Tara Reid is going to be on Primo Nutmeg next week. Don't miss it. Thanks again, folks. Thanks for all of the support over the past 5 years. Again, I appreciate all of the big name guests that have been on the show. I appreciate my friends and my family supporting me and doing this show. I appreciate all of my patrons for financially supporting the show. And I appreciate all of my viewers and listeners, all the people that follow me on Twitter and have liked my Facebook page. Again, it's really an honor to know that tens of thousands of people out there would follow me and support me and continue viewing me and sticking up for this channel at times when it may have been hard. So I really do appreciate all of your support. You guys are great. You couldn't be better. So thank you again from the bottom of my heart. It's really been an honor to provide you with content over the past 5 years. And please do tune in next week for my big interview with Tara Reid. Thanks again.
Spends most of their life living in a totalitarian system. It's called having a job.
Challenging a foreign policy establishment and the military-industrial complex.
This is what happens when you start to really threaten the system.
You walk out, you say